Good evening, YouTube. I am back. I am here to talk about something that doesn't have much to do with tools. When I started coming back and making videos, I sort of asked myself, do I want this to be a tool channel, or do I want it to be a channel where I just do whatever I want? When you want to attract viewers to a channel, what you really need to do is settle on an audience, settle on something to talk about. Because if you talk about everything, it's like you're talking about nothing, and nobody knows what it is that you represent. So, I mean, if they think about tools, if they say they think about Keith Finner or A-Bomb 79 or one of the big tool channels, they know what they're going to get. And that draws people. And if you just kind of blither around and talk about all sorts of things, you're likely not to attract people. I thought about that, but then I thought about the fact that I don't really care that much whether I get a viewership. If I did, I would certainly be making better videos, and I would be trying a lot harder. I kind of like just being self-indulgent and doing whatever's on my mind. So I think that's what I'm going to go with. So I thought I would talk a little bit about my dad's testimony. And it's an interesting story because maybe I have said before on this channel, I don't know, very often when you listen to preachers, especially this is really true of TV, you'll hear them say things, testimonies, spectacular stories that you know are not true. I mean, something inside you says that's not true. They lie, they make things up, they borrow lies from other liars and pass them around. The thing I always talk about, I'll tell you one of the lies I love to talk about is the Moravian slave story. Moravia is a place in Europe, don't ask me where. And there were a couple of religious guys there who were supposedly brothers. And the story is that they felt bad about slavery in the West Indies, so they sold themselves into slavery and they became slaves so they could preach to the slaves in the West Indies. And there's this story about how they were on the ship waving a tearful goodbye as their families waved at them, knowing they would never see them again. And there's just an infinite number of things wrong with this story. Like, first of all, it's just not true. Go to Wikipedia and look it up. Second, you couldn't sell yourself as a slave if you were a white person back then. The fact that you wanted to be a slave didn't mean that you got to do it. It's like when you go to your parents and say, I want to join the circus, you know, it's not really up to you. The slave trade was based on race, so you couldn't do that. If you look the story up, you'll find out there were two guys who were not brothers, and they went to the West Indies temporarily, and then they came back, and they were not slaves. So it's really not a dramatic story at all. Basically, the story goes like this: there were a couple of guys in Moravia that wanted to be missionaries, so they did that, and then they went home. Anyway, my dad had a testimony that was highly improbable. I mean, miraculous. And it's true, unlike the stories that you will hear on TV, so I think that's a big bonus. My dad, I told in another video, I don't know how many times I've said this because I can never remember what's in what video, but my dad hated God. My dad was an attorney, he was the best lawyer I ever knew, and very sharp. But he did not like God. He was very proud, he was cruel. I'm talking about when he was young. He was selfish, cheated on my mother. I mean, I don't want to go into all the things that he did. He was violent. We were afraid of him. We looked forward to business trips. My sister and I used to encourage my mother to divorce him, which is really something when you're talking about, 10-year-old, a 13-year-old. And anyway, he was bad news. He had this terrible attitude toward God and toward the church, and he ridiculed anyone who had anything to do with it. And over the years, I would pray for him. I was not much of a Christian, but I did not want him to go to hell. And I would pray for him. And nothing seemed to work. He always came back with the same attitude. So, I turned back to God in about 2007. I was undergoing some personal stress, so of course I went back to God for selfish reasons. I thought God could help me out of my problems, and of course he did, but in the process he helped me to understand that it wasn't all about my problems. It was about becoming his son and being one with him and having love pour through me instead of anger and impatience and so forth. It was about giving myself completely to Him. It wasn't about paying money to people on TV, hoping that God would say, well, you gave me $1,000, so I'll give you 100,000. You know, I mean, you can think about all the things that people do, the reasons people turn to God. I turned to God out of selfishness, but He managed to improve me somewhat along the way. I started going to church. I started going to a church called Trinity in North Miami, Florida. And Miami Gardens is where it is. Miami Gardens is kind of ghetto. And it's a church run by a wealthy white family, and the purpose of the church is to promote that family and make them rich. That's it. And the pastor is a guy named Rich Wilkerson. His son, Richie, or Rich Jr., is Kanye West's pastor. All these people are saying, oh, it's so wonderful that Kanye West has turned back to God. And, you know, yeah, it is wonderful, but he's under a very toxic influence. That's one thing. And another thing people need to think about is Kanye West knows virtually nothing about God. He just got started, and he's not in a position to be teaching anyone. He shouldn't be running services. I don't care if he's Mozart. I don't care if he's the most talented person that ever lived. He should be sitting in the back and trying to get it together with God. And quite honestly, he should be getting his home together. He cannot control his wife, who I mean, is the leading promoter of sexual sin in the United States, perhaps in the Western world. She is, I don't want to use any nasty words to describe her, but she is a low person who needs correction. So, you remember what the Bible says. If you want to appoint a bishop, you find someone who's in charge of his own house. So anyway, this church was run by people that were materialistic, and they control people. They milk people like cattle. You know, they get people to volunteer to do free work for them, and then they manipulate and use them and suck them dry. So, but there were some nice things about the church, and one nice thing was I felt God's presence there. And I said, well, I felt God's presence before because Jesus visited me twice when I was young, and I know what God's presence feels like, so I'm going to keep going to this place. And I didn't realize God's presence had nothing to do with the pastors. That God was there in spite of the pastors, not because of them. So I spent 3 years there as an armor bearer, which means kind of a security guard slash janitor slash gopher. And then I went to another church. It was mostly Puerto Rican. Trinity was mostly Haitian. The next church was mostly Puerto Rican, and another very emotional church. A lot of stuff going on with the Holy Spirit, but there was also a lot of nonsense and a lot of pride, a lot of false prophecy. And I ended up leaving that church. Then the pastor turned out to be a pedophile, and now he's in prison. So anyway, I don't know why I'm going off on these things. I turned back to God and started praying for my dad, and not too terribly long after that, he started showing symptoms of dementia. At first, he just became kind of forgetful. You know, he was able to practice law until 2015, and it's only 2019 now, so you can see, well, what I'm trying to tell you was it wasn't that bad at first. It was just little things. You know, I'd have to tell him things twice. And he slipped and slipped and slipped. And at some point around the end of 2016, I think it was, I had to start taking care of him. At first, I had to put his pills in a special box, you know, days of the week and so forth. And I had to make sure, I had to put him in the box and give him the box and say, take these. And then eventually it ended up, I had to take the pills and put them in a place where he couldn't find them, and I had to give them to him. You know, so things like that started happening. And then I ended up driving around, taking him to all his appointments, handling all of his business, handling his tax returns. And he got worse and worse. And so, of course, during this time, I was praying, as I always had, God, please save my dad from dementia. You know, restore his mind, restore his memory. And help him to know Jesus, help him to get over this pride that he's got, this bitterness. He was treated he and his family were treated very, very badly. I said this in another video right after his father died. This is the story that his family told. His father was a sheriff. He idolized his dad. This is back in eastern Kentucky. And around 1942, his father drank some moonshine and died because moonshine can destroy your kidneys. So he drank some of this stuff. His kidneys were pretty much destroyed overnight, and there was no dialysis, so he died horribly. And not long afterward, the pastor of the Presbyterian Church told my dad's sister to stand up and tell everybody that moonshine killed her father. And supposedly this is why my dad always hated the church. It had nothing to do with any rational, you know, reasoned argument against God. Not that there could be such a thing. So I prayed for God to take away his bitterness and his anger, and you can imagine. And nothing worked. And he actually had experiences where God reached out to him and did extraordinary things trying to get his attention, which is why I have this life jacket here. And I will explain that. At some point, while I was going to Trinity, he grabbed me and said, I have to talk to you, I've seen a miracle. Now, this is somebody who denies the existence of God. And he says he's seen a miracle. So I'll tell you something funny about atheists. I'll tell you, just as an old person who knows a couple of things, there's very few real atheists. There are a lot of people who are angry at God and want to make him feel bad, so they say they're atheists. But there are not very many people who are really atheists. And my dad was not a real atheist. He thought he was. So he said, it's been a miracle. And he wanted me to explain it to him because he knew that I knew something about God. So he had a huge boat, a big enough boat to where it had 2 bathrooms. And he used to go sit on the boat and watch TV and read the newspaper and enjoy himself. It was in the water all the time. You couldn't put it on a trailer. So he would hang out at the marina. And one day he was coming back home. He was leaving the marina to go home. And he saw a life jacket floating in the water. It was in an area which 2 sides were rock. There was a rock wall here and a rock wall there. And then there were boats packed together on the other side. And there was no place for this thing to go. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It was landlocked. It couldn't just float away. And it's a life jacket. It can't sink. And it's bright orange. You can't miss it. So it's a hard thing to lose in a marina. He got himself a boat hook. He walked all the way over to the boat, which is maybe less than a minute's walk. Got himself a boat hook so he could get the jacket, because my dad, he liked money, he liked stuff. So he saw something free, he was going to get it. And when he got back to the jacket, the area where the jacket had been, it was gone. And he knew this could not happen. There was no possible way for this to happen. So at the age of maybe 80, he climbed down on the rocks. He had to climb down like 8 feet or something down a rock wall so he could walk around on the rocks by the water and look to see where this jacket had gone. He risked his life, really. Didn't find it. So he came home and asked me what was going on. And I said, well, you know what a life jacket represents? It represents salvation. God is trying to show you that your opportunity for salvation is not going to be here forever. And, it had no effect on him. So a few weeks later, he grabbed me again, said he wanted to talk to me. And so, patiently, because it was not always a good thing when my dad wanted to talk to me, I went and sat with him, and he said, the life jacket is back. He said he did his usual thing at the boat, and he started to walk home, and saw the life jacket in the exact same place where it had been before. And he went and got a boat hook, and this time the life jacket remained, and he went and got it. And he was so freaked out by this that he took it to the boat and hosed it off, and he kept it in the boat, in the saloon, which means the living room. He kept it there. And he asked me about it, and I said, well, maybe God's given you another chance for salvation. And it kind of reflects what happened to him at the end of his life, because he rejected God and then came back to him. So that's a spoiler. He kept getting worse, and both of us ended up moving to, we had this agreement that if I did not abandon him in Miami, this was before he got dementia, so don't start thinking I'm a bad person. I was just going to move up north and get away from Miami, which everybody wants to do if they have any common sense. It's an awful place. We had this deal that we made. I would wait for him, and he would buy a much nicer place than I could up north, and we would get away from Miami together, and I would look after him. And he would have his area, and I would have mine, and we wouldn't be in each other's hair too much. So we ended up buying a place, which is where I now sit. And I took care of him there. So he got worse and worse. He had a condition, we believe, with dementia, you don't really know what you got. I mean, maybe there's some types of dementia where you actually know what it is while you're alive. But there are certain symptoms, and you just kind of line them up with what's happening and what the, WebMD or whatever says, and what your doctor says, and you finally say, well, I think he's got this kind. So we thought he had vascular dementia. That's what his dad thought he had. His doctor thought he had. And it's caused by, poor blood flow in your brain. So, brain cells die and die and die, and you're left with less and less to work with. So, I was the accidental caregiver. I was not, some people love to make a big fuss about how they love putting themselves out for other people and changing diapers and all that. And, that has never been my thing. I'll do things like that because they have to be done. But, I'm not one of these guys who, when they see you with a baby, they have to grab the baby and cuddle it and show how great they are with kids and all that. It's not me. I'm not that kind of person. I'm perfectly happy to let somebody else clean that stuff up. And I really dreaded the whole idea of becoming a caregiver. It wasn't the work that I minded, although I wasn't happy about it. What I minded was things like, I knew what was coming. When you're a caregiver, you're going to see your parent naked a lot. You're going to be dealing with really gross messes that you ordinarily would not deal with an adult. There's going to be a lot of moments where that person has no dignity whatsoever, and you have to be there. So, wasn't really what I wanted to do with my life at that point. But there was no one else. My mother was dead. My dad didn't have a girlfriend. My sister was a sociopath. I wasn't married. That was it. I had no kids. So I ended up taking care of my dad, and I learned some things that might be useful to other people that are in this situation. One thing I learned is nobody's going to help you. I don't mean now. Maybe you come from a big family. Maybe you're Catholic and your parents had 48 kids, and everybody wants to pitch in because they're wonderful people. But generally, you're going to be. What's going to happen typically, I think. I'm not sure about this, but I think typically what happens is even if there's a lot of people available, one person volunteers to do the job and everybody else says, oh, good. And then they step out of the picture and they wait for the funeral and the will. And they wait to clean out the house with a U-Haul. So you're probably going to be alone. You're probably not going to have much help. And something else that you may not understand is that the doctors won't help you very much. The social workers, the internet forums, people say, oh, join a support group. I joined a support group. And I found the people to be self-righteous. And that sometimes they were nasty. There was a lot of I hate this term. I hate the way we talk now, this hipster talk. But I'll use a term that hipsters use: virtue signaling. There's a lot of virtue signaling, and if you let it slip that you weren't St. Francis of Assisi, then you could get piled on. So I joined this group and then I quit because it was unpleasant. I'll tell you what happened. I complained because a hurricane was coming, and if you live in Florida, you know this. People on the news deliberately lie and exaggerate about how bad hurricanes are going to be, and they do this to get ratings. And they do this on the internet too. A hurricane will be long gone. It'll be gone. It'll be like 2 weeks in the past, and you'll still see videos, suggested videos. Hurricane Thelma or whatever, barreling down on Miami, and Hurricane Thelma's gone. And even when it was around, it never came close to Miami and never threatened Miami. And it was, they'll say Category 5. Well, it seems like they're all Category 5 when they're offshore, but when they come to the coast, most of them are Category 1 or tropical storms. That's just the way it is. But the people on the news, they deliberately lie about it. They jack it up to get ratings and scare people, which would be fine, except there are people watching who believe this, and that includes demented people. So children, maybe people who are, I don't know what the word for mentally retarded is right now. Please forgive me, but whatever the word is for that, the acceptable word, people like that, there are people who fall for this nonsense. And if it's a demented person, not only will they fall for it, they'll fall for it over and over because they'll forget. And so you'll have to tell this person 3-4 times a day, we're not going to be swept away in a flood. So I remember I mentioned something like that, and I got so much bashing about how I didn't care about people getting sufficiently prepared for hurricanes and how I didn't take it seriously. I was in Andrew. I was in a place where the winds were about 180 miles an hour. So no one can tell me anything about hurricanes. So anyway, I found them unhelpful. You're going to have to learn about a lot of things really quickly, and one of the problems you're going to have is that things are going to happen that you didn't predict. You're going to try to prepare, and things are going to hit you anyway that you didn't see coming. I can tell you some things that will be helpful to you. First of all, get yourself some supplies. If the person you're caring for needs a lift to get them out of the bed, or a toilet beside the bed to protect the floor. If he needs a rubber pad, you don't care how beautiful the carpet is, put a rubber pad over it. You know, have a little common sense. Whatever you need, buy it, get it. Don't wait around until something happens. You know, try to be proactive and get ahead of things. You need a kit for your car. You may not think about this, but there may come a time when the person you're caring for makes a mess in a public place, and then you got to drive him home. You can't call an ambulance for somebody just because they're dirty. You know, it's on you. You're not gonna, no Uber driver is going to take them. So I got something for my dad. I got a big gym bag, and I got some coveralls, some big loose-fitting coveralls, like $20. I got a pair of socks, a pair of shoes, bunch of rubber gloves. They're special bags. They're plastic bags like garbage bags, but they're treated somehow so they kill odor. So you can put things in there like soiled clothing and fasten them up and not have to worry about the stink. You know, you're going to need sterile wipes. You can imagine the kind of stuff you're going to need in a bag like this. You're going to need things like washable, maybe quilts or cheap blankets. You're going to need car seat covers. You should already have a car seat cover if you've got somebody who's in this condition. What you're going to be able to do, what you want is to be in a position where if something happens and you're away from the house, you can protect the car, because otherwise you're never going to get the smell out of it, and you're never going to be comfortable in that car again. You want to be able to protect the car from any contact with the material, and you want to be able to get the person himself cleaned up to the extent where he's not going to be a problem, you know, where he's going to be comfortable and not embarrassed, and where navigating him back into the house and so forth isn't going to leave a mess everywhere. So that's a little tip for you. You need one of these kits. You're going to need chemicals that you spray on things to kill odors. One of the best things you can get is something called Nature's Miracle, and what it does is it destroys urine. It turns it into something else. So there's no smell anymore. You can get stuff that covers it up. There's something called Odoban, which covers it up. You don't want to cover it up. You want to turn it into something that is no longer urine. And Nature's Miracle will do that. It's made for pets, works for people. So those things will be helpful to you. You also want to be able to keep track of the person you're following, you're taking care of. They will wander off. And, you know, sometimes they're perfectly all right physically, and they can walk. Maybe they can run. So what I did was I got an app for the phone called Life 360, and it has a little GPS map on it. It tells you where they are. So if they wander away, you can find them. That's very helpful if you happen to take them to the store and they just hit the road. There's probably better things out there. There's probably a little GPS tracker sold specifically for the purpose. But I used Life 360. Before my dad got really bad, he was trying to go to Wendy's like a mile and a half away, and he ended up going to North Miami, which was 15 miles. And I was able to use this app to find his car, and he followed me home. That was before he got so bad that I was able to get the car keys away from him permanently. So I don't want you to think that I said, oh, my dad has dementia, I'll just give him the car keys. That's not the way it worked. That's something else you need to be ready for. There's a lot of things that you're going to want to, there's a lot of restrictions you're going to want to put on the person you're caring for their own good, which are necessary and humane and intelligent and not nothing to be ashamed of. And they're not going to say yes. They're not going to say, here's my car keys, I'll just be a pedestrian for the rest of my life. You know? So I don't know what to tell you what the answer is with regard to that, but I'm just telling you it's going to happen, probably. I mean, some people who are demented are very nice and very cooperative. If you're blessed like that, thank God, but don't expect it. So another thing you really need to know about is hospice. Now, a lot of people think a hospice is a building like a bed and breakfast for people who are about to die, and you go there and then like 3 weeks later you die of cancer and then you're gone. And that's not the way it works now. Now what hospice means is people come to your house, and it's paid for by Medicare if you have Medicare. It doesn't cost anything. And they'll come 3-4 times a week, and there'll be occupational therapy, physical therapy, social workers, nurses, nursing assistants. They'll bathe the person you're caring for so they get at least 3 decent cleanings a week. They will clean up the room that they're in. Sometimes they'll fix food if you want. They check their vital signs and all that, check their medications. It's not fantastic. It's no substitute for you know, a 24-hour nurse or assisted living, but it's helpful. And something else they can do for you is respite care. They will put your patient, in a place for, I think, 5 days a month, something like that. They'll send them to an assisted living place, and you can go out and be by yourself for a little while. Even if you can't get in the car and drive someplace, you know, to another state to relax, at least you can be by yourself for a little bit and gather your thoughts. Now, the problem with that is you can't necessarily choose the place where they go. And assisted living, another thing you need to know is assisted living is not that great. You need to tour the places. When it gets to the point, as it did for me, where you have to put someone in assisted living, you have to go and tour the places yourself, and you have to tour a bunch of them. And when you tour them, you don't call up and say, I would like to come in on Saturday the 19th at 10 a.m. What you do is you go there when they're not expecting you, and you knock on the door and you say, I want to see this place. And if they won't show it to you, don't use that place, because they have secrets. One of the places that I went to actually told me this. He said, if you want to see this place, you just show up and don't tell us. I toured places. I'll tell you something else. The cost doesn't indicate quality. I went to places. There's one place that was over $7,000 a month, and the cheapest place I found was like $2,800. And I was going to end up putting him there because they seemed very good, and he had already been there. He seemed comfortable in the place. He'd already been there for 2 or 3 days on one occasion, and it just seemed like a good place. It seemed fairly clean and all that, but I ended up putting him in a place which was like $3,100 a month, and the reason I put him in that place was there were the original place had 2 wings. There was assisted living, and then there's what's called memory care, which is where your patient is going to end up. And assisted living just means older people who maybe need a little help with mobility and stuff, but basically they got it together. They're not demented. Memory care is for people who have to be confined, you know, so they don't wander off. It's for people maybe who can barely talk, you know, who maybe need help eating. So the first time my dad went, he went to the normal area, the assisted living area, and the second time they decided he had to be in memory care. And the memory care area was disgusting. It was dirty. They had roaches. So I got him out of there. He was only there long enough for me to understand how bad it was, and I started looking for something else. And I found a place which was very clean, and the people were great. The atmosphere was wonderful. They had activities. I mean, it was as good as it can be for that kind of thing. So I ended up taking him there, and that's where he lived out his final days. And I was very happy to find that place. Every time I mentioned that place to someone who was helping me look after my dad, like somebody from hospice or a doctor or whatever, they'd say, oh yeah, that's a good choice. You're lucky to have him there. It's something else you're going to have to look out for. Some of these places, they will throw your relative out when they get to a certain point. And some of these, there's different levels of licensing. Some places can only take care of you until you get so bad, and then they throw you out in the street, and you got to find someplace else. And they don't tell you this when you check in. They don't tell you this when you sign a contract. The place where I put my dad just happened to be the only place in this county which was able to care for people until they died, no matter what happened to them. So that was fantastic. I mean, God helped me find that place. I ended up putting him in this place, and he resisted it. He hated it. And I wasn't happy about it either, but he had reached the point where I just couldn't do it. I just could not do it. He needed care around the clock, and there was just no way. So some strange things had been happening in his life. Back in 2018, he had started to change a little bit. He had started to be less mean, less angry, and so forth. And he started to show a little interest in God. So at some point in 2018, he prayed the prayer of salvation. We're on our way to a barbecue restaurant. We're talking about God, and I said, he seemed kind of receptive. And I said, well, why don't we just pray that God will show you the truth and help you do whatever has to be done? And he said, okay. And then on the way back home, I mentioned it again. He said he wanted to pray for salvation. So we prayed for salvation. I thought, well, maybe this is it. You can lose your salvation. People say you can't. That's not true. The Word says no one can snatch you out of God's hands, but it doesn't say you can't jump out of His hand. And if you look in the Bible, there's plenty of examples of people who appear to have lost salvation. It's mentioned in Revelation. That's the New Testament, not the Old Testament. So it's a problem. But I was happy because it was the first time he'd ever done anything. head in the right direction. Well, we started attending church occasionally in this area, and we went to a place called, I think, Meadowbrook, and it turned out to be kind of a new agey, feel-good church. There's a bunch of churches called Willow Creek. It's a big organization. All they care about is getting people in the door, increasing membership. They think if they increase membership, I don't know if they actually think that, maybe all they care about is money, but they seem to think, what they imply is that what they care about is getting as many people there so as many people can get to heaven as possible. And of course that's nonsense. You don't just get people saved so they can go on being what they are. God wants to change you through the Holy Spirit. And if He doesn't change one generation of believers, then the next generation is going to be useless, which is what happened to the church, which is why it's weak now. So it's not acceptable to have that kind of church. And they talked about mindfulness, which actually comes from Hinduism and Buddhism. It's actually a form of meditation. It's demonic, is what I'm trying to tell you. It's satanic. So he didn't like that place. He kept saying they're only after his money. And he was right. Very often people who are worldly and not Christians or have just become Christians see things the rest of us don't because we're trying to believe the best about people. My camera just turned itself off for a minute, so I turned it back on. But anyway, he did seem to believe at this point. And then when I got him into the assisted living place, he was starting to get really, he had changed a lot. He was treating me differently. He would say things like, "Here comes my beautiful son," which I just didn't know what to do with. He kept talking about how wonderful I was and what a pleasure it was to see me. But there was a dark side too. He would say that whenever I left, it was like a black cloud descended over him. And that, the reason for that was the cloud that he lived under all his life. It was a cloud of demons and evil thoughts that he had always had with him. He just hadn't recognized it until he had seen something better. That's something that happens with people who aren't right with God. They'll want to be around someone who is right with God so they can kind of leech off of your connection with God, and they don't know they need to get it themselves. So anyway, we talked about God and so forth, and we got to the point where I was not able to leave him there and not visit. I thought when I put him there, I'd be able to go, a couple of times a week, make sure everything was all right. And I found out you can't do that. And one reason was he was dying. I knew he was dying, and I kept seeing signs that he was going to be gone before I had thought. I had thought it might be a year or whatever. And God started telling me he's not going to be around on April 1st. So I saw signs in him. Right after I put him in this place, I went over to see him, and he asked me what my mother's name was. He asked me if I had a sister, and I said, we're in the home stretch. I got to take this seriously. So from then on, I went every day. There were like 1 or 2 days I missed for some reason. I mean, good reasons. I didn't just, I wasn't at the horse track. We don't have a horse track here, but you know what I'm saying. I went every day, and I got this camera that I'm using right now so I could film him and have some more memories. I have some memories of my dad after he had changed, after he had this wonderful, new, gentle personality. He was effusive. I would come in the room and I'd sit and talk to him, and he'd just go, "I love you." Like he just realized this, and it was the most amazing thing, and that he had to share it. So he had completely changed. And we started listening to YouTube. I was trying to find something to do while I was there that would help him to turn to God. And the conversations were really bad anyway because they were repetitive and they were about trivial things. So I got an MP3 speaker, a Bluetooth speaker, and I started playing YouTube audio through this thing. I played audio of Derek Prince sermons, and I'm not talking about Joseph Prince, who is poisonous. He's a money preacher. Stay away. Excuse me. Derek Prince is an old-line Pentecostal. He was a missionary in Africa. He's all about the Holy Spirit, all about healing and miracles and prophecy, but he's not about money. He's not one of these people who says, "Send Benny Hinn money and God will give you a new Mercedes." He passed away in 2003, I guess. And he gives people a nice solid grounding. No teacher is perfect. John said you don't need any man to teach you. The Holy Spirit is the one who really does the teaching. But you still need to hear from people, until you get close to God. So Derek Prince, I would play his material. And when I started playing these things, my dad got very quiet. And I watched him on one of these occasions. I think it was the first time I played one of these things for him. His head rocked back and his mouth hung open and his eyes were kind of half open. And I was afraid he was dying. So I kind of poked him to see what was going on. And, he said, I heard every word. And he started talking about how much he liked it and so forth and how it was peaceful. And I was stunned because I wasn't doing anything. You know, you can't bring people to God. You can tell people about God, but the Holy Spirit is the one who does the work. And the Holy Spirit was doing this stuff. You know, finally, this weight of dragging my dad around was off my shoulders. And through these videos, God was doing the work. So, you know, every day I'd go there and he would insist that I pray and we would talk about God and he'd talk about how wonderful God was. And he'd say things like, he'd listen to these videos and he'd say things like, come on in, he says. You know, things I hadn't told him. And while this was going on, I started to feel bad. One day I started to feel bad. I thought, well, I'll tell you something that I haven't mentioned yet. And something around maybe 2015, God told me, I've cut your dad off. And I didn't know what he meant. And I realized later that what he meant was, he didn't mean he was going to kill him. What he meant was God had taken his patience away from my dad. He was out of patience because my dad knew that God was there and he just chose not to pay any attention. And he had made other people miserable unnecessarily all his life, and he had poisoned his own family. And God had given him excellent living. He had given him wealth. He had given him really good health, considering the fact that he drank whatever he wanted and ate whatever he wanted. I mean, he was obese and he still had good health. So God did a great deal for my dad. He gave him a wonderful wife, 2 kids who, at one point at least, were full of potential. Made him an American. You know, I mean, he did a lot of good stuff for him. Gave him his own law firm. And my dad repaid him pretty shabbily. So what God said was, I'm taking away my patience. And so from then on, my dad's dementia that's when he really started to slide into dementia. And all these health problems developed, the heart failure that eventually got him. So when that happened, I quit praying for my dad's memory to be fixed. You know, I had been praying for it for years, and I quit. I thought, well, if God is out of patience, then I'm not going to sit here and waste my time trying to get God. I'm not going to second guess God. So I stopped praying for my dad to be healed of dementia. And on this day when I was driving over to see my dad, I felt bad about that because I was talking to God and I said, you know, I'm going to inherit everything he's got, and it's a conflict of interest for me not to pray for him to be healed. And I said, you know, are you sure about this? And I felt like God released me. I felt like he was saying, you go ahead and pray for your dad. So I prayed for my dad to be healed of dementia. And at this point, he was this wonderful, warm, kind, patient person that I was totally unfamiliar with. And of course, I was afraid. You know, I had always been afraid. What if he comes out of this dementia and his pride comes back and he turns away from God? Well, the next day I went to see him, and the nice new dad was gone. He was having an argument. He was cursing at his roommate and calling him filthy names. And he was angry at everybody. And so I got him in his chair. He was in a wheelchair by that point, and I pushed him to the place outside where we usually sat and started to calm him down and started talking to him about God. And he said he never believed in God. He only prayed to make me happy, which wasn't true. But he said this. He said it was all a lot of nonsense and fables and so forth. And I thought the exact thing that I thought would happen has happened. He seemed sharper. His mind was coming back. His anger was back. His pride was back. And now he was rejecting salvation. And I was sitting there praying to God, you know, what do I do? And I had this idea, and God, I believe, put this in my head. I said, wouldn't you agree that no matter what the truth is, the most important thing you can do in this life is to be prepared for the afterlife, whatever it is? And he said, oh yeah, you know, you believe that was obvious, because it is obvious. And I said, what if I pray that God does whatever has to be done to help you to be prepared for the afterlife correctly? And he said, okay. So we prayed together. And I asked God, I said, take away whatever has to be taken away, give him whatever has to be given to him. Only please see to it that he's saved, that he knows you. So I came back the next day, and the nice new dad was back, and my dad was not as sharp as he had been the day before. You know, when you have dementia, it's like going down a set of stairs. One day, you know, let's say your IQ is 120, and the next day, you know, it may go along that way for 3 months, and then the next day, at the end of the 3 months, it'll go down to 105, and then it stays at 105. It doesn't go back up. I'm just using IQ points as a tool for reference. I don't know if it actually works that way, but what I'm trying to say is you become less intelligent in jumps. It's not gradual. And you don't ever go back. So he had gone back. I mean, I prayed for him to be healed, and his intelligence had increased, and he had become angry and proud. And then I prayed this other prayer, and suddenly that increase was gone. So I left it alone at that point because I knew he wasn't going to be around long. My dad had always been overweight. He usually, throughout his life, had been like, 225, 230, something like that, sometimes 270. And the lightest I'd ever seen him was something like 185 back in like the late 70s when he'd gone on some kind of crash diet. And he sort of started losing weight in 2018. I didn't know it. It's just something weird that happens with people who have who have congestive heart failure. They tend to be kind of swollen from fluid and stuff, so they look puffy and all that. But they still may lose a lot of weight, and you won't necessarily notice it because they kind of look flabby. And my dad didn't look thin, but I took him to the doctor's office one day, and I found out he had suddenly lost about 30 pounds. So he was getting smaller and weaker, and before I took him to assisted living. And on this week, after he did all these things where he accepted salvation again and all that, this week when he did all these things, things got physically worse, and he lost his appetite, and suddenly he just didn't want to eat. Like he'd eat a little bit of breakfast or whatever, and that was about it. And it got to the point where they said he just wasn't taking food. And I didn't know if it was temporary or whether he was going to bounce back. The Monday after all this happened, some lady who worked over there called me, and she said, based on her experience and her observations, I needed to get over there. And I knew what that meant. She thought he was dying. So it was, I guess, about noon, something like that, and I got over there not long after, obviously. And I found him. I didn't realize how bad off he was. He was in the process of dying. They should have just said, your dad's dying. I don't know why they didn't do that. And he looked bad. His flesh looked like wax, and it was as though you could see his bones through it, and his hands were ice cold. And he wasn't able to speak. He was just breathing, and he wasn't talking. He wasn't talking back to me. And he had a do not resuscitate, which is something, it's a document that you create. If you're a smart person, you create this document when you get old and infirm. And it says they're not supposed to take extraordinary measures to keep you alive. Heroic measures, I think they call them. If you don't have this document, what's going to happen is if you die, they're going to jump on your chest, they're going to stick you full of needles, and they're going to hook you up to machinery, and the machinery is going to pump air in and out of you. And they're going to keep you on this stuff as long as possible. And you may actually be dead, or you may have come back and you may be worse than dead, and you will suffer tremendously. So my dad had one of these documents. So we didn't, when I saw my dad in this state, we didn't, I'm talking about me and I'm talking about the people who worked at this place. We didn't call an ambulance, we didn't call doctors, we didn't start, looking for things to inject him with. That's not the way it works in hospice. What happens is you sit with them and you pray for them and so forth, and you wait. So that's what I did. And when I put on my Derek Prince stuff, I had my little speaker with me, and I put on a message about praise, I think it was, praise and thanksgiving, which was very appropriate at the time. I started praying and telling my dad everything you could possibly want to tell your father at that stage, especially if you've had a bad relationship with him. I told him he didn't owe me anything. I told him he had been a great father. When I was young, I couldn't respect my dad. The Bible doesn't tell you have to respect your parents. A lot of people think you have to respect your parents. That's not true. The Bible says you have to honor them, and honor is an outward thing. You treat them as though you respect them. But it doesn't mean you have to respect them in your heart, because for some people, that's like, what if you're John Wayne Gacy's son? You can't respect John Wayne Gacy. God would not ask you to do that. So I had never been able to respect my dad. There were a lot of things about him he had a lot of bad traits and so forth. So I had never been able to say I had a good father or that I was happy with the father that I had. But in the weeks before he died, that changed. His personality changed, everything changed. And I would tell him very sincerely what a great father he was. And I was able to tell him that while he was on his deathbed. And I kept telling him, you don't have to go. If you want to stay, stay. If you want to go, Jesus is waiting for you. The strangest things happened. Even though he was dying, his skin warmed up, his color turned back to normal, the color came back into his face. His labored breathing became smooth, and I started thinking, maybe he's coming around, maybe he's going to be all right. But that's not what happened. he became very peaceful, and he became motionless. You know, he was just barely breathing in and out, just the way he was when you listened to the videos out on the patio, you know, where we had been listening to them. And things tapered off, and eventually I realized he wasn't moving at all. So I had to call someone, and they confirmed that he was gone. And the interesting thing about that is that I have a friend who runs a hospice, and I have another friend who's worked with dying people for years. She was a certified nursing assistant. Now she's some kind of nursing management person. And she had seen dozens of people die, and she said nobody goes like that. She said people go in terror, they go screaming. She said out of all the dozens of people she had seen die in the Miami area, 2 had gone peacefully. And I was shocked. I didn't know that. You know, my mother went peacefully. I was there when she passed away. I just thought that was normal. And my friend from the hospice, he said the same thing. He said they're in terror, and a lot of the times they're alone because people dump them there and then they don't come back. I noticed when I was visiting my dad, it was unusual to see anybody else there, you know, anyone but a patient or someone who worked there. So my dad got a very pleasant end compared to a lot of people. You know, he got a very smooth, peaceful transition, and he went straight into the arms of God. So that's the testimony. That's my dad's testimony, and because I was involved, it's also my testimony. I don't know what to tell you beyond this. I would just say I hope the practical tips I'm giving you about taking care of people will be helpful. I know they will if you put them to use. Hopefully your experience will be better than mine was. But when it comes to the supernatural things, don't stop praying for people to be saved, and remember that God will help you, that it's not your job. You're not responsible for how they receive the message or whether they get saved. If someone goes to hell, it's not your fault. It's them. It's all on them, how they receive it, whether they finally give in. My dad could have come to Christ, you know, he could have stayed with him when he was 11 or whatever it was when his father passed away. He could have come back when he was 20, when he was 30, when he was 40. He chose not to do that. And that's on him. That's not my fault. That's no. Maybe some of the blame goes to that pastor who insulted his family, and maybe that's why God showed him so much patience. But basically, you're not responsible. When you stand in front of God at the judgment seat, He's not going to ask you what your next door neighbor did, what your pastor did, what your wife, what your husband did. He's only going to want to hear about what you did. So all you're responsible for is giving them the message. And the good thing about that means God is going to do whatever else has to be done. Whatever else can be done, He will do it. And He did it for me. He did it for my dad. So don't despair. Don't think you're in this trying to pull somebody across the goal line. You're not. You're just there to hand them the ball and give them a little push in the right direction. And then somebody else will take over. And I'm sorry to say, they may not go. Most people go to hell. That's how human beings are. I wish I could say something more uplifting, but that's just the truth. Most people go to hell. So you tell them the most helpful things you can, and you pray for them. And then don't beat yourself up because you've done everything you can. I can't think of anything else I want to add about this. Maybe next time I'll get back to the tools. And I'm still working on my arbor press stand, and I got my machine tools back from the Miami area finally. 7,000 pounds of machinery, 7 or 8. Moved them up here at a cost of $7,000 plus whatever it cost me to go down there and get a hotel. Yeah, it's thrilling to have them back. It's absolutely phenomenal. Not having your machine tools, it's like being in a wheelchair. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this, or at least you weren't too bored. And I guess I'll see you in the next video.